unless something changed in the middle, or two girls. I don't want to be sexist here, but that would, to me, would be the purest form of research, because they're in the same home, maybe the same parents, and if something changed, to me, that would be the red flag or the green flag. And if one was turned out with great scores and the other one didn't, that would also tell me something. So is there any sibling studies?
Through the chair, I don't know if you can see me smiling, but that's you're right. We're always looking for the ideal counterfactual population to make inferences against, and so sibling studies are always really good, especially when we have time duration where we would be able to look at things that have changed in that family. Unfortunately, in Alaska, when we look at the number of repeat mothers that have been sampled and then respond again, the numbers are just too small for us to be able to utilize our survey and weighted data. However, we have successfully replicated Alcan Link now in Oregon, and I'm providing technical assistance to 8 other states to do it, so that maybe through pooled analysis and collective use of information, we can do exactly what you're talking about and study changes in families.
Thank you. And last question, I think, is there any breakout between urban and rural?
Through the chair, we have done a variety of analyses looking at different demographics in urban and rural and seeing differences. One of the studies that we did, we've published nearly 20 studies now on this work. And again, I'm just giving a snapshot, and we have looked at when we look at accounting for other factors that may be explaining a relationship, we do have to design 2 different models, a model for the urban environment and one for the rural environment, because the factors are just somewhat different. However, there are themes that continue between both. If you're violence in both, that has the same effect. And so, yes, we have done analyses by those different areas and regions.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Eastman.
Thank you, through the chair. In the brochure that was passed out at the beginning of the meeting, it said the estimated lifetime cost per victim of fatal child abuse and neglect is $1.5 million. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
So through the chair, that was our indication, and it actually kind of ties in just to the cost. So as indicated, Pat Sidmore back in 2016, who led the initial collection and of ACE's work, then also utilized it and did the calculations of what is the predicted costs of ACEs. And so what we have here is like the health, behavior, or outcomes and estimated annual costs linked with those ACEs. So he was able to go through and just look at, we know when someone has 4 ACEs, they have a higher risk of smoking, which leads to COPD, heart disease, liver, all those things, and people that are on Medicaid. So many factors were put into this, and they were able to do some estimated costs. The same as with the child abuse, that we know that when children are experiencing, and there's actually, I can get you a full detail on the actual cost of child abuse. We have a full analysis, and actually also Jared and his team did something very similar. We worked off of their original estimate that comes out with what the cost of child abuse and neglect is, which incorporates the cost with OCS, but also anything medical, if they're needing of special education. So multiple factors were put into that to come out with these numbers.
Follow-up?
And how would you respond to the argument that I've heard on occasion where, in the case where child abuse is fatal, obviously it's not good for the child, but it's actually a benefit to society because there aren't needed for government services and whatnot over the whole course of that child's life?
Through the chair, can you say that again? Did you say a benefit for society?
Talking dollars. Now you've got a $1.5 million price tag here for victims of fatal child abuse. It gets argued periodically that it's actually a cost savings because that child is not going to need any of those government services that they might otherwise be entitled to receive and need based on growing up in this type of environment.
Through the chair, Representative, I guess that would be the idea, if I can use a really bad analogy, when you hit somebody, always back up because it's cheaper to insurance. I don't pertain to that, and I'm really I'm not even sure how to answer that there's a cost saving to the death of a child. The impact that has on a family and us as a society when a child is lost, especially to child abuse and neglect, is unmeasurable. And it's hugely tragic.
And follow
Follow up.
And the way that you're calculating this 1.5 million, and when I say you, I mean the people who did calculate it, does that 1.5 million get higher or lower depending upon the age at which the child is killed?
So again, there's multiple factors, and a number can definitely increase, but again, I don't believe it's going to matter if they're older or younger. Again, a loss of a child is really unmeasurable.
Follow up.
Follow up.
Trevor, if I might just interject through the chair, the cost projections like that, when they take into account life lost, they take into years of potential life lost. And so if you're younger, you have more time of potential being productive. So the costs aren't just deficits, they're also assets that you might provide into it as being a productive member of society. So most cost benefit analyses try to account for both aspects of that to come up with this estimate.
Follow up.
Follow up.
And so would the 1.5 million price tag, would that be different if we're talking about a 6-month-old versus a newborn on day one, or would it be the same?
They would be marginally different.
Thank you.
Representative Gray.
I'm gonna pass it right now, Madam Chair.
Representative Grow.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. I want to, first of all, I guess I want to join with Mr. Storrs, and I'm disturbed by the recent line of questioning. And as someone who's prosecuted child abuse cases, it was very sad and terrible. And I do. Ask Mr. Storrs, do you think that, you said repeatedly that you think that getting into some of the brain science would also be helpful, and we have apparently Dr. Chamberlain coming up later. Could you describe briefly why that would be useful or how that ties into the rest of this presentation?
Well, and again, I guess Dr. Linda Chamberlain will outline it, that just understanding what is happening to a child, because again, understanding how the brain is developed and how does toxic stress, again, my apologies through the chair, how does toxic stress impact? So, because there's different types of stresses, and again, Dr. Linda Chamberlain will talk about that and help you understand, and then we'll connect it back to the Representative Carpenters of like, what can we be doing in the sense of as the community, as a state, to really be addressing this, to really be building a healthier, more robust community and state.
Follow up.
Thanks.
Well, let's go to Dr. Linda Chamberlain, epidemiologist, for your presentation. I want to make sure that we have time to ask you a whole litany of questions so we can understand this. So please state your name for the record and begin your presentation.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to talk with you. My name is Linda Chamberlain. I'm a trauma epidemiologist, worked for a couple decades for the state of Alaska, and now consult to around Alaska, working with nonprofits and other states as well. With regard to what we were just discussing, and you could come to the first slide there, Trevor, please. The brain science is a framework for understanding what we see on the ground, patterns of problems that we didn't understand. And I'll just give you an example, whether working with like domestic violence shelters, the clustering we see in classrooms of problems with kids with trauma, and also relative to the direction that research is going in this field, the new data that Dr. Parrish is going to be collecting, and also what we're seeing nationally and internationally, PACEs. They're looking at the positive aspects of what makes a difference. The brain explains things that we, again, didn't understand, such as seeing that it's often the youngest children in the household that are the most profoundly affected. And that kind of leads into this first slide. I'm going to say I have 12 slides. They're not about numbers. They're about understanding patterns and implications based on the best science so far, understanding that we're learning every day. And in reality, I see myself as a community educator these days. I'm talking about neuroplasticity as kind of the big picture of both the risk we see relative to exposure to adverse events and also the resiliency, the potential for healing and rewiring. This is play foam, and I use it in talking with kids, actually, families, communities, and that's very much when I think we're talking about, again, implications of this work. Relative to making choices, or whatever terminology we want to use, people need to understand how this affects us. And neuroplasticity has only been understood for a couple decades. We were seeing the ACEs data, but then it was the really revolution in brain neuroimaging that allows us to see what was happening developmentally. So that neuroplasticity, next slide, please, Trevor, and please, stop me at any time with questions, and I can always skip some slides too, because it's more important I'm responsive to your questions than getting through my slides today. But this is what we're talking about. There is this explosion of synaptic pruning and development, brain connections going in, right experience at the right time. Social connections make brain connections. This is the dilemma and the overlap that we're looking at relative to COVID, the effects of the pandemic right now. But the bottom line is if you look at those numbers, this is happening very early. And so those first years are key in terms of getting the connections in. Some periods are critical, others are sensitive. I'll show you one in a moment. But it's, there's certain genetic aspects of this, epigenetics, nature, but environment nurture is going to play a huge role. So if you go to the next slide, this is content that, again, we use a lot in community education and working with families and such to understand that there's this sequential building block framework that happens in putting the brain together. And what we didn't understand until the neuroimaging that allows us to look in now is that the connections, they're in for the brainstem, the lower survival area of the brain, those first couple building blocks, in terms of the stuff that when a baby is born will allow them to operate separately from their mom. So, body temperature, heart rate, and so forth. But those connections are formed. But as we start moving up those building blocks, getting into things that, by the way, are extremely frequent. You see it in the ACEs data: digestive problems, sleep problems, difficulties managing emotions, and so forth, going into that limbic building block, and then up to cortex, the thinking area of the thinking and learning area of the brain. Those connections are not in. They are waiting to connect, and they are stimulated by environment and experience. There is tremendous plasticity in that area of the brain, and that child's world is going to hugely determine what that looks like. Then you consider, next slide please, that there are certain things that need to happen at certain times, and that the emotional blueprint for the brain, the areas that are connecting, are happening much earlier in life than we begin to realize how important those first years of life are and how these building blocks go together. And I'll show you how they can be altered by early trauma in a moment. But next slide, looking at types of stress. In no way I'm saying here that all stress is bad. Stress is developmentally necessary to develop resilience. Actually, resilience doesn't develop in the absence of stress. However, prolonged, unaddressed, in the absence of nurturing, of caregivers that can support a child, that's when we see a problem, and when we go into that red toxic stress, and that is what can alter how the brain puts its connections together, how the brain organizes, and then seeing the types of developmental and costly problems that we do. Next slide, please. So looking at these building blocks, and I know this slide can look kind of crazy in terms of all the numbers and stuff. The bottom line is that for kids to reach their potential, to be the types of productive adults that we want to see in society and so forth, no surprise, you want to be spending more and more time, not in survival brain, but upstairs in those upper brain areas, the cortical and limbic area, putting the connections together, because that is where we learn how to self-regulate, to problem solve, good judgment, seeing consequences of one's behavior, and so forth. The dilemma is that if it just makes a lot of sense, and yet we had to see this in terms of imaging and so forth to understand that if kids are spending more time in the lower building blocks of the brain, which is what we see here, you want to see a 2-to-1 ratio between the upstairs and the downstairs brain. What we can see with developmental trauma is that it's more of a 1-to-1 ratio. They're hanging out more in the lower areas of the brain. It's not about being stupid, it's about being in survival mode, but there's a dilemma there in terms of reading deficits, speech delays, even profound verbal performance IQ split, because you're not focusing developmentally in the areas of the brain that allow us to develop language skills and so forth, but rather being on the ready. It is why so much of this has been missed in the past, seen as attention deficit, for example, versus trauma. And you can treat the attention deficit issues, but it's not going to be so helpful until you get at the underlying issue of trauma. And I think this is true for a lot of challenges that we see in working with families, with kids, why it's so important to understand how this works. Next slide, please. I just want to show an example of how we, again, talk to families about this. This is from a project in Iowa called Connections Matters, and there's lots happening in our state relative to what the Alaska Children's Trust and the state of Alaska are doing, but how do you talk to people in an everyday way to understand what this looks like in a classroom? And that's why I was talking about upstairs, downstairs brain, to understand as we start going downstairs, as stress becomes too much and starts to go toxic, how it interferes with our capacity to focus, our ability to manage emotions, and therefore we see more aggressive behaviors. We see, and ultimately we're going to see more diagnoses and all of that. Things that are talked about relative to the ACEs data that you're looking at. Just mention, next slide, please, that, the dilemma, toxic, at the time that the emotional blueprint is going together for kids and their stress circuitry as well. There's certain areas of the brain that are involved in stress circuitry, and they are very, very sensitive during childhood. And also now we know during adolescence, so looking at adolescent programming around trauma is very important too, because of some massive remodeling that goes on. But it really interferes with the ability for many of these children to be able to self-regulate, because it can kind of mess up hormone and neurotransmitter levels in the brain. So I have a few more slides I'm going to use here, but the next slide, please. This is from the Harvard Center for the Developing Child, where so much of this research is coming from. And it's just to know, again, that persistent stress is going to affect brain architecture. It's like, when you look at those circles, it's like the tail of a beaver. You want a bushy brain. You want to see lots of long hairs, guard hairs, in this case, lots of connections happening. And what can be seen with toxic stress is fewer connections, that synaptogenesis is impacted, and it's impacted in the prefrontal lobe that's right behind your forehead. That's kind of like the CEO of the brain and air traffic control, and also in the hippocampus, which is very key for memory making and therefore learning. And it's why the trauma sensitive work that's been happening in the state of Alaska, and as I work with a lot of other states, and I would say Alaska is just on the forefront of this work, and seeing that big picture. And it's so important because all you have to do is sit down with educators, and they educate us about what this looks like, and they so often know what's going on for that kid, for that family. I'm going to skip the next slide and just say a few things here, make sure that I think I've touched on most of this. What do you see when you got a brain with that kind of 1-to-1 cortical ratio, and or that the stress response has been reconfigured, which is so very common. It's a more impulsive, reactive, got to get you before you get me. I'm on survival mode, always on the ready brain. It's much harder for them to get upstairs when they are under stress. You see a developmental disconnect. They have the computer skills at 12 to break into Nassau, but social emotionally, they're 7. And it is why having social learning skills is so critical in the schools. It makes a big difference. And this just last slide totally interferes with learning, as I've already alluded to. And I think you can, see the stuff there that I've already said. So I'm just looking at the clock. I'm going to stop because I know there's more to hear from Trevor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chamberlain. That was a very quick but thorough presentation on just how our brain responds to trauma. And Mr. Storrs, did you have more?
Yes. So thank you, Dr. Chamberlain. And back to understanding those choices, those parents themselves probably have those 4, 5, 6 ACEs scores, and just understanding how their brain is working. Those brains aren't just the kids' brains, those are also the adult brains. And when they're in that downstairs, they're not always able to make those choices that we would hope they would make, and or sometimes they don't even have the resources to be able to make those. So it's just to kind of help set the precedence of what is going. Again, not what is wrong with somebody, but what has happened to them, to understand why are they doing X. Again, it doesn't alleviate that behavior, but it helps us understand and start doing. And as Dr. Andis said, what is predictable is preventable. So really quick, the way I kind of talk about it is life is like an elastic band. And as Dr. Chamberlain talked about, there's those stressors. You have positive, tolerant, and toxic. Positive is I got a test tomorrow. Tolerable is I got a D on that test. Toxic is when I go home and get beat for that D. But either way, it adds stress to that band. And if you don't have the knowledge, skills, supports, or resources to lessen that tension, it stays there. And from our perspective, every day there's stressors, and we play with an elastic band. And if you pull it too tight, it will snap. And for us, that's where child abuse and neglect can occur. Overall, the work that we do. So what we're constantly looking at is how do we make sure people have that knowledge, skills, supports, and resources to lessen that tension, to reduce many of those risks. They've looked at resilience. There are some key things. We know when a child has a caring and loving adult in their life outside the primary care providers, it reduces risks. When they have a sense of connected to community, so they've already started doing this. So just when we look at children with follow through or staying calm and shows curiosity, these are actually resilient behaviors. These are those social behaviors. And you can see here in this study, it's on the left is special health care needs, and then the resilience skills. The more of these resilient skills you have, the less of the special health care needs are needed. And then going back to the economic, if they need less special health care, our costs, whether we're talking Medicaid, special ed, and so forth, is greatly reduced. And again, it's that upstream. And we know when we invest in like early childhood, for every dollar we invest, we get $7 to $13 back. We invest in adults or in corrections, we don't get $1 back, we actually lose money. So, and that also ties into that brain science that Dr. Chamberlain spoke about. So it's going that upstream, that primary prevention. So what do those strategies look like? Connect youth to caring adults. Again, and we have seen research done through taking the YRBS data in Anchorage, and they applied it and looked at when a caring adult outside of the primary care providers. That is not meaning that we're replacing parents. It takes parents to raise a child, a community to uplift them. But parents can't do it all, as much as we try. And when kids have that secure adult to go to, it reduces their risk. So after-school programming is key. Mentoring programs, sports activities, coaches, even within the religious community. When you have those mentors and those connectivities, it lessens those risks. So they may experience adversity, but the impact of that adversity is decreased. Getting to what the Representative Carpenter was asking about. Strengthening economic supports, having the ability to go. You've had an experience. There is major wait lists. Kids that are being interviewed and identified who are going through child sexual abuse or major child abuse, physical abuse, are on months wait lists to see mental health counselors. And many of those counselors, unless you have the money to pay and or have health insurance, you can't be seen. Having the economic supports, divorce, it's not about going through divorce. A single income really reduces the ability to have kids in after-school programs, into childcare, connecting with those loving adults, those mentoring programs, and so forth. So that economic supports. Provide quality childcare and early education, we talked about. Promote and connection to culture. We know that when somebody doesn't feel connected to their community or a sense of belonging, it increases their risk. To what Dr. Parrish was talking about, system navigation. Many of you have heard about the SNAP program, the issue that we're having. Well, just understanding how to navigate that, also Medicaid or any of the other systems. When somebody has that support, so the more that we can streamline our systems, get rid of barriers, and allow people to access, it improves social economics, connecting the kids and the family to the supports that they need, and the resources can have a major impact. Healthy relationships, just around the domestic violence, and it doesn't. You need to start early. Domestic violence does not start after the age of 18. We know there's families that have come and talked, and the legislature years ago passed Bree's Law because of teen violence that is occurring. Enhancing parenting skills and enhancing primary mental health care. Great example is just looking at the postpartum expansion that is being discussed at the legislature. The more access folks have to these services, again, reduces that risk. So these are those upstream things that provide when people do experience, because you can't prevent all toxic. As Dr. Parrish spoke about, the loss of a parent, a death. We can't prevent that. We can't prevent all trauma, but we can predict it and then surround both the child, the family, and at times the community with these protective factors that can greatly reduce the long-term expense and the impact to children and families. That was really fast because you asked so many great questions. Any follow-up?
It is 3:01 p.m. And if I will afford something really quick, but want to be respectful that all of our schedules are extremely full, including our speakers. So Representative Gray.
Thank you so much. Through the chair. I just wanted to say thank you to Mr. Storrs for the presentation, and also to respond. I had an intense reaction to something that was said earlier. I adopted my child through the foster system. My child came with a very high ACEs score. That definitely meant that we had resources that needed to be expended to help my child. But what I heard was, and it may not have been intended, but what I heard was that there would be a cost savings if a child with a high ACEs score didn't survive. And I would just say that for me personally, my child is the greatest joy I've ever had, that there is no price tag on that. And I just wanted to say that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you for sharing, Representative Gray. Representative Eastman.
Thank you. Through the chair, real quick. Appreciate the presentation. And you had mentioned corrections a moment ago, and by the time we're investing money, and we do invest a lot of money in corrections, that we're not, getting those dollars back. Would you think it would be better for society if we were to take some of those dollars and put it into preventing things like child abuse?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we're at this stage where you can't just take money from corrections today because you have these individuals in. But if we don't want to continually see corrections and Medicaid and all these other tertiary costs increase, which we've been seeing over decades, we need to really be investing in prevention. And unfortunately, we have neglected prevention for so long that we've been seeing these high costs. This won't just disappear. It's taken us decades to be where we are. It's going to take a couple decades to change it. But if we don't start today, we're going to be even one more day late. So we need to start doing both. Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Storrs, Dr. Parrish, and Dr. Chamberlain with the Alaska Children's Trust for your presentation today, to committee members for staying a few more minutes. It shows that the more that we invest in strengthen families by being good parents and community members ourselves, the better our children's outcome is going to be. So I would like to conclude our business for today. The House Judiciary Committee will meet again on Wednesday, February 22nd at 1 p.m. for a department overview by the Department of Public Safety. Seeing no other business before the committee, we will adjourn. Let the record reflect it is 3:04 p.m.